Good afternoon, everybody. I assume you can hear me. We're good. Sorry for the late start. I was just trying to get things set up, and my apologies for that. But I appreciate your attendance. And to get started tonight, I want to do a study that kind of grew out of a Bible study we were doing at the house about submission. And I know that already many of you are cringing. You're like, oh, submission. Because I know it's everyone's favorite subject, and I do get that. But we had done a study at the house about it for the obvious reasons, right? I've got kids. I wanted to kind of run through this. And we looked at it at face value from Ephesians 5, obviously. And I just wanted to get a candid view of what it means. And even in our Bible study, I was surprised that I learned kind of a lot. And so I just thought it might be relevant and helpful to you tonight. Do you ever think, I'm going to make sure this is working, sorry. One more time. Okay. Have you ever thought about, there we go, I got it, okay, about what actual role submission plays for us? You know, what role, if any, does submission play in our relationships with family, friends, and coworkers? And can submission in any way help us actually see other people's strengths? I want you to think about that. Or, in your mind, does submission only really mean kind of the kind of assumed, right, the preconceived notion that we're in a subservient role, where we're invaluable, and maybe you think it is synonymous with you being unintelligent or something like that. And obviously, I understand that is not a very attractive thought to have, is it? And that's why I wanted to kind of look at it a little bit. But today, what I think is that the way that we act and react in our relationships really matters, and how we kind of respect each other and our actions of respect and submission and even leadership, which I'm going to touch on for a while today, really affect our relationships, both kind of, you know, interpersonally and at work, and also a little bit about how we even react in society. Now, as an introductory verse, and rather than just going straight to Ephesians, I want to look at 1 Peter, and it's interesting because Peter writes in this chapter and the next very similar language to what the Apostle Paul talks about, and there's a little bit of crossover. But I wanted to look at this one first. It says here, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution, okay? Whether to a king or as one in authority, or to governors as sent by him for the punishment of evildoers and the praise of those who do right. Okay, so submit yourselves. For such is the will of God, that by doing right you silence the ignorance of foolish people. Peter says, act as free people and do not use your freedom as a covering for evil, but use it as bond servants of God. Honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. So here, Peter, he's writing to Gentile believers who are spread across modern-day Turkey. And he's telling them that, you know, because they're under persecution. And he says, you know, you need to submit to the government. And I think this is kind of a huge deal, because guess who's emperor right now? Nero. Okay, so it's not a great situation. It's not a supportive government by any means, and the king is not their friend. He brutally killed Christians. He reigned from AD 54 to AD 68. Bad time. But the point of the passage is that Peter says, submit for the Lord's sake, and that's important. Now, I want to define this word submission. I know that you know it, many of you do, but it's hupotasso. And what it means is arranged under or support. Hupotasso, arranged under. And it's subtle, but I do want you to know that this doesn't actually mean obey. Okay, I want you to keep that in mind, because that is kind of going to be important through our study. So when Peter and when Paul's talking about submission through the rest of our study, we're not talking about obey. That could have been the Greek word hupakuo, which Peter or Paul don't use. Okay, they use submit, and we'll talk about that. This means something different. This means that you willingly arrange yourself under to support the structure of whatever it is you're doing. And that's important. Now, we know that Peter wouldn't say that it means obey, because in Acts 5:29, Peter says we must obey God, not human authority, because God is our moral guide, right? Not a national law. That's not where our authority comes from. It comes from God. And so, yes, we have to submit to government. My lesson's obviously not about that tonight, but it's the same word. But we have to submit in a form of respect, willfully, in organization, and in truth, by the way, as was mentioned in the verse from 1 Peter. So, so we do that so that we can focus on godly, right actions, doing good, and ethical behavior. Okay? Now, this may be painfully obvious, but submission and the concept of subjection is throughout biblical history. It's throughout many people and entities. And by the way, I made a question list because my kids said, you know what would be really cool? They said people like questions and answers. And so if you have a copy of it, just write these down, because some of these are going to be answers to the paper that you have a copy of. And I hope that maybe helps think about it. So maybe I shouldn't read all these because there's a lot. But these talk about submission and subjection. Jesus, when he's 12 years old, he catches back up with his parents, and it says he was obedient to them. That's hupotasso, okay, here. The earth is subject to frustration, Romans 8:19. The entire Corinthian church, Paul's writing to them, 1 Corinthians 16:15. He says, you know that the household of Stephanas were the first converts in Achaia, and they've devoted themselves to the service of the Lord's people. I urge you, brothers and sisters, the Corinthian brothers, to submit to such people. He's saying, willfully work with them. He's not saying like obey them in that sense, right? But work with them. So Jesus submits. The Corinthian church submits. The entire church, Ephesians 5:24, submits. Mary, who we talked about in my last lesson, the final lesson on the women of faith in the Bible, she submitted. She said, I'm going to do whatever you ask me to do, when the angel Gabriel came to her. And again, Jesus, John 6:38, this one is not the word hupotasso, but he says, for I've come down from heaven not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me. Same concept, right? Not the same word, same concept. So based on these initial examples, I want to simply propose a thesis for this afternoon study that submission does not mean that our opinions don't matter, okay? Submission doesn't mean that you're not smart, okay? It doesn't mean you're inferior or anything like that. It doesn't mean blind obedience. But real submission, as seen through the lens of Scripture, is a reflection of our respect and our relationship with God. So let's now jump over to Ephesians 5. We'll start at verse 21. Now, I'm going to use the New American Standard Version, where it calls it the section Marriage Like Christ and the Church. The easy-to-read version calls it Wives and Husbands. The Message version calls it Relationships. And these are all accurate to what we're talking about tonight. It's in the middle of a section where Paul's writing to the Ephesians about how to be imitators of God. And that's what he's getting. That's the underpinning focus, is how do you imitate God? And in the middle of this, he talks about relationships. Verse 21, subject yourselves to one another in the fear of Christ. Wives, subject yourselves to your own husbands as to the Lord, for the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is also the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body. But as the church is subject to Christ, so also the wives ought to be to their husbands in everything. And I'm going to keep reading about the husbands. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. So husbands also ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we're parts of his body. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is great, but I'm speaking with reference to Christ and the church. Nevertheless, as for you individually, each husband is to love his own wife, the same as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. So what does this tell us? How should we, as husbands and wives, or people who may sometime be husbands and wives, what does it tell us about how we should treat each other and respect each other? I think it says we support each other in a respectful way, and a way that obviously means we have to give a nod of focus their direction, someone outside of ourselves. And this reminds me of Philippians 2:4, where it says, do not merely look out for your own personal interest, but also for the interests of others. Like, we have to look out for other people? We have to be aware of them? Well, I mean, it's obviously true, right? And this is really why a lot of people don't get along well today, because they seek their own desires instead of others. For a bit of comparison, I looked up some antonyms that means opposite. I realized when I was typing out antonym that I couldn't spell it. So opposites, Cambria said, remember it's got a Y. So the opposites of submission tell us a lot, right? It's words like this: rebellion, defiance, willfulness, disobedience, and self-will and self-sufficiency. Now, I do want to be clear. We are talking about relationships where there's not like pure evil going on, okay? So in the understanding and the context that we're talking about, we're just saying that what would happen if you tried to run your right relationships with self-will, right, with disobedience? It's not going to work. And those relationships are not going to last very long. The problem is, this is actually what we see in humanity. Humans, we tend to be selfish. It's a little bit like what we talked about in our singing last Sunday night. You can argue with people about the truth of God, and you can say, it's clear, like God is true and the Word is true, and obviously if the Bible is true, then the Quran can't be true, right? We can logic through these things. And if God is true, then the book that has morality laws in it is also true. But at the end of the day, when you talk to people like that, they actually aren't very interested in it because they don't like the requirements of morality. And so they don't object to it because it doesn't check all the boxes of logic and truth. They object to it because they don't like it. And that's what we see here. They object to it out of defiance. They do what they want to do. This is a huge subject in the Bible. I looked it up. There's like over 200 or more times where the subject of conceit and pride and selfishness are of focus, which also reminds me of Proverbs 14:12. There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death. And that's why Paul's teaching on this and on relationships is so important. If we just did what we want, our relationships will suffer. So I want to look back at Ephesians 5:22. I want to focus first on submission, on the wives. And then we'll read the husband's role. We'll see how these work together. The New American Standard, which we read before, says, wives, subject yourselves to your own husbands. And I like that because it doesn't just say submit, but it says the real focus of the word subject yourselves, which the easy-to-read version, which I also like using a lot, expands a little bit. It says, wives, be willing. Right? We're speaking of a willful choice. Be willing to serve your husbands the same as to the Lord. Paul's words are clear here. The intent is submission, right? The same as to the Lord. This is not just something that Paul thought about women. He says, yes, the husband is the head of the wife, but it's for a reason. Because the husband-wife relationship is like the Christ church relationship. And Christ is the head of the church because he saved it. Okay? Christ earned the right through that sacrifice, and since Christ saved the body, he is the head of that body. And wives thus should be willing to serve the husband in a similar way. I hope it's clear that this is not merely a submission to the husband because of his maleness, right? This is not submission just because he is to be the boss, right? That's not what it is about. But it is about this relationship provided to us through Christ. Wives, you're not a doormat for your husband, right? You are not a slave to mere whims. That is not real submission. It's a willing choice that, by the way, you get to make, okay? You get to make that choice to love and support the other person. Now, verse 25, husbands. You may have noticed, just side note, that when Paul's talking to did I say Paul? I meant Pete. I'm sorry, Paul. Sorry, yeah. When Paul's talking to the wives, he spends 3 verses. That's not a quiz question, but it could be. He spends 3 verses talking to the wives. He spends a total of 9 verses talking to the husbands, okay? And I should probably mention also, this should be a quiz question. My wife did not make me write this lesson, okay? I want you to know this. I came to it through my own study. So yes, I'm writing it myself. So 9 verses, and I find this surprising. I bet that while maybe, maybe some of you cringed at submission, I bet no men are cringing when we're talking about the husbands, because we're like, he doesn't mention hupotasso, it's fine. We don't have to worry about submission. No problem. I got this. I am, after all, the husband, right? But I hope that you see that it's not quite that easy. And this is what's going to teach us a little bit about real leadership. Okay, what is real leadership as a reflection of, or as tying into, real submission? Now, it actually starts back at the wife's summary, right? It says that the husband is the head of the wife. And it's not a value judgment, okay? It's about responsibility, okay? The headship is a statement of responsibility. So it says there, verse 25, husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for her, so that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, that he might present to himself the church in all her glory, having no spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she would be holy and blameless. Now, we're going to focus on verse 25 first. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. That's the husband's responsibility, to love his wife. Guess what? The Bible doesn't say rule his wife. Okay? The Bible never says that. That might be one of the quiz questions. But rather, to love his wife. That is important as we discuss the submission leadership relationship. And the intent with which he loves is how Christ loved. So we're talking about like a high level of love here. He, the husband, is responsible for Christ-like leadership, which everybody knows is servant leadership, leading by service. And we'll read about that. This reminds me of Christ's deep devotion, Philippians 2:9, where it says, Christ emptied himself by taking the form of a bondservant and being born in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death on a cross. It is interesting because Christ's love is not merely kind of a reflection of how we might love our wives. You know, Christ loved the church no matter what. He died for it even though the people who were in it were pretty terrible, right? Loved us when we were sinners. And that is a little different because obviously we love our wives for many reasons. We are allowed to love our wives because they cook well and because they are beautiful and because they have grace. Like, we're allowed to love our wives for all those reasons. But the beauty of how Christ loved is because he loved kind of despite all of that. His example is so sacrificial that it wasn't because, church, you make me look good, right? Christ didn't care about that, right? He loved even though he was loving the church that was, or the members that were imperfect. And that's important. So the first responsibility tonight of the husband is love in this sacrificial way. So he loves her. We love our wives, even if it means we have to give our life literally for her. The second responsibility, I'm going to go back here. Okay. The second responsibility is actually verse 26, okay? And it talks about this idea of sanctifying the wife, sanctifying, presenting the church without spot or wrinkle. So, husbands, it's interesting. It's something that I don't actually think about that often, but I need to, but we have a responsibility to continually support the purity of our wives. Christ is the purifier of the church. We have a responsibility to support the purity of our wives, to lead them in holiness. And there are several ways that we can infer from the passage, but one is simply encouraging spiritual growth, right? Being the man who will encourage spiritual growth through prayer, through regular Bible study, and then, of course, the obvious, not leading into sin. I mean, that really can happen and is obviously never desirable. It's so obvious. But we try to lead through study and through prayer and never leading into sin. On review, I really like the version from the Message. I'm not sure if I'm playing it the wrong way. The Message. Check this out. Husbands, go all out in your love for your wives, exactly as Christ did for the church. A love marked by giving, not getting. Christ's love makes the church whole. His words evoke her beauty. Can you imagine what our relationship would be like if really and truly our wife said, I feel whole because of you, right? You make me whole. Everything he does and says is designed to bring the best out of her, dressing her in dazzling white silk, radiant with holiness. And that is how husbands ought to love their wives. It's beautiful. So I think we're starting to see the relationship of real leadership from the husband consistent with the demonstration of this true love. So is Paul done yet? Not even remotely. The third and fourth responsibility of the husband are under how he loves his wife as if he loves his own body, and in the same way. It says there, so husbands also ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his own wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ also does the church, because we're parts of his body. The third responsibility is nourishing. Okay? You ever think about that? Nourishing our wives. Here he uses a unique word. I don't have it, but it's the Greek word ektrepho, and it's used a total of twice in the New Testament. And the only other time it's used is actually in Ephesians 6, verse 4, where it's telling the father to be careful not to provoke his children to anger, but to bring them up, to ektrepho the children. And this is interesting because obviously Paul's not saying you got to treat your wife as a child. But no, he's just using that same word, how you would be so careful and willing to bring up your children, right, to just guide them, but to also have that mindset in how you sort of protect and support intellectually and spiritually, mentally and emotionally your wife. That you are there for her to nourish her in that same way, okay? You don't treat her like a child, but you nourish her in the very same way, right? It's like a guy doesn't treat himself like a child, right? That would be illogical, but it's the same context here where he would nourish her in the same way that he nourishes himself. So he says, well, I need whatever, and I'm going to give that to myself. And in the same way he does it for his wife. Cherishing, fourth responsibility. So a husband is not only to nourish, number 3, but also to cherish, number 4. Yet again, Paul here is using a unique word, also only used twice in the New Testament. The other occurrence here is when Paul's writing to the Thessalonians. And when he writes to the Thessalonians, he says that they cherish their time with them, Paul, Silas, and Timothy, and that they valued the time that they spent with them so much. It was the word cherishing. And it was a focused, loving care. And kind of in a similar way, this is also a word used with children. And so it's the word that would be if you're holding your child and you're telling them how much you love them and you're caring for them and you're listening to them, and they are your number one priority. And that's what this word is about. That cherishing is about how your wife is your number one priority. Okay? So we cherish our wives by doing the best we can to provide warmth and security, a safe environment that simply shows our commitment to them and that they are a priority. Any husbands squirming yet? Like, should I stop? There's just a couple more. The fifth responsibility is about honoring the husband-wife relationship above all others. Still staying in Ephesians 5, verse 31. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. Now, here Paul simply clarifies what is probably obvious, okay? That there's a reason that a man needs to leave his parents, right? Because living with his parents his entire life is not the match made for him, right? That's not where he belongs. There's another better match for him, and it's his wife, right? That's what it's actually about. He has to leave his parents and become one with his wife. because his parental relationship is not what he needs to sustain. Everyone would see that as strange if you were, I know it happens today, but if you're a 35-year-old, 40-year-old, I shouldn't say an age just in case, but, and you're still living with your parents, it is, less usual and not the plan here. What happens at the point that you leave your parental relationship to be bonded and joined in your marriage relationship is that you create a new permanent family. That's what you do, right? You by yourself, you are not a family. But when you are married, you become a new permanent family, a picture of the relationship with God, right? That's what you're doing. And in marriage, we create that when we are married. As such, Paul says, the two shall become one flesh. This is not merely a reference to the physical connection, but is physical, emotional, and spiritual that goes along with the creation of that permanent family unit. He does say, nevertheless, I am talking about Christ and the church. So he zooms out for a moment, and then he goes back into to say, but individually, still, each husband is to love his own wife, the same as himself, and the wife must see to it that she respects her husband. As Kristen said when I was going through this, honestly, right, Paul is creating sort of like the Mr. Darcy typology here, right? It would be very easy to submit to a husband who is like this. Now, we should all try to be this, right? But that's what we're talking about. If the leadership relationship is right, and if your intent of how you manage your marriage relationship is correct, then the submission makes sense and is easy. The sixth responsibility, I'm going to borrow from, one more. I'm going to borrow from 1 Peter, okay? Again, as I said, 1 Peter 3 and Ephesians 5 cover much of the same topic, but I did want to cover a couple from 1 Peter. So this is the sixth and next to last. Don't worry, it's not going to go all night. Sixth responsibility for we husbands is a full dedication of the support of his wife. You husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way as with someone weaker, since she is a woman. I can't believe he even read that, right? Like, why would I read this? So dangerous wording today. What could Peter be talking about? He must be confused. How can you call a woman weaker? Okay? Do you think that he is saying she is weaker intellectually? No. Is he saying that she is emotionally weak? No. Most scholars, and most commentators, believe that he's simply making a comment about what is the typical understanding of normal biology, okay? He's also not saying that 100% of women are weaker than 100% of men. I can guarantee you right now that there are, some women in this crowd who can bench press more than me, leg press more than me, deadlift more than me. No question, right? In fact, some of you might be able to bench press me. It's possible, okay? That's all that Peter is saying, is that in general, maybe in general, you've got a wife who is physically, weaker than a husband, and no more than that. That's all we're talking about. The main focus of it, thus, is that he's saying, live with your wives in an understanding way. Live with them in an understanding way. The Amplified says, with an intelligent regard. Okay, think about that. With an intelligent regard. The contemporary English version says, Be thoughtful to your wife. And the King James Version says, according to knowledge. According to knowledge. And as you might guess, it's the Greek word gnosis. We've talked about that before. And this just indicates the knowledge and the gaining and the seeking of that knowledge. Okay? So what does this tell us, right? Just think for a minute. What does it tell us? It means that we need to try to spend time understanding our wives. That's what we're talking about, okay? A man understanding feelings, goals, needs, fears, that's right. That's what we're talking about. And I think that it's fair to say that if our wives tell us we don't understand them, then we're likely falling a little short of this goal. I was thinking of it like this. When it comes to understanding, when it comes to knowledge, I think it's pretty clear that if I get a new phone, okay, it's probably a bad example because I don't try to figure out my phone very well. But if I get a new toy, if I get a new piece of audio equipment, if I get a new tool, I look at it and I try to figure out how it works so I can understand it. And it takes time to read it and know what it says so I can understand what it does, so that I can be thoughtful and have an intelligent regard to how that tool will work. Okay? You might have different things. I don't know. You might have video games that you like. You might have a tractor that you like, or some other kind of a tool, and you have to figure out how it works to make it work. And I know what you're thinking. My tractor has an instruction manual, you know, and wives don't. But it just takes time to understand and figure out those needs. Spend that time to try to understand. Okay, this leads us to our seventh and final part of our study tonight, honor. And show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered. I think there are many ways that we can show honor, many of which we've covered tonight, haven't we? But in context, I do like to keep it in context. In the context of 1 Peter 3:7, how is he talking about honor? Look at it. Fellow, heir of the grace of life. He's talking about equality. We honor by understanding that there is a level of equality between us and our wives. It's awesome because we are equal partners in the blessing that comes from God. In God's eyes, we are a son of God, and in God's eyes, our wife is a daughter of God. We share and are equal in the inheritance, if you will. We're co-heirs in our life together in support of God and of the inheritance of eternal life. And so together we share this, and that can be our mindset in our, again, permanent family unit that we have created. Not hierarchy, mutual equality. So, bringing it all together tonight, if we're just summarizing, looking back at it, I'll just ask, is the wife's submission passive or is it active? Okay, think about it. Is it passive in the sense that she is forced to do this, or is it active? I hope that you can see by the verses that we've read that it is a willful plan to submit. It is active in that case. Is the husband's love passive or active? Is the husband's sacrificial love? Is his servant leadership, does he get that role, that responsibility, just because he is man? Or is it active, and he gets it because he knows that there's responsibility there that he has to fulfill? It is, as you guessed and have probably already filled out, it's active. I underline those so you can circle. So what does this tell us? The relationship we're talking about tonight is not a one-sided contract. All right? It works mutually and to both sides. Submission and sacrifice to make this actually work. So, in conclusion this afternoon, what have we learned? Real submission, real leadership. Real submission means willingness to serve. But wait, real leadership also means willingness to serve in a few different ways. Actually, 7 ways we had to talk about for the men, right? That's a lot. Think about that. Maybe we will squirm next time. We learned that submission is willing, listening, learning, focus on God, and that leadership is not mere, granted to you as a man, but is a responsibility that you have to earn and fulfill by listening and understanding and looking at your family and seeking family flourishing, spending time and seeking God together. I think this is important for me. I learned a lot in our little study, and I hope that it is helpful for you. Tonight, I don't know, again, where this is with you. I hope, obviously, that everybody is excelling at this. But as I will definitely not say that I've knocked out all 7 of those on the husband's side, I know that I have work to do. Tonight, we haven't covered, as we say, first principles. But what have we talked about? We've talked about Christ. We've talked about his sacrifice. That's what it all comes down to today. If we're talking about submission tonight, guess what? All of us need to submit to Christ. Submit to the plan of salvation. That's what we have to do. That's what we have to be mindful of tonight. We do that by hearing the word, by hearing his sacrifice, by understanding that it is the way that we come to him, that it's the truth, that only through Christ can we be saved, can we have eternal life. It is the only way, and there is no other. If you're ready to do that, then we'll immerse you tonight for the remission of your sins. If you have other prayers and needs of us tonight, then we welcome you because we want you to be right with God. We welcome you tonight. We invite you wholeheartedly to come forward while we stand and while we sing.